Evening everyone. I'm just making a hasty list because I've got a little topic for us to start off with, which I think will be interesting, but I've seen some comments in the chat. I'm going to write them down because once we've gone through the first topic, we're going to come back to these. Let's have a look. So we've got training doctors. That's quite an interesting one. Not the one we're going to start off with. And what was another one? Someone said something. Oh no, that was it. Those two. So we'll come back to those. I will come back to them. But I thought we'd start off because it's quite interesting to me. The situation with Rishi Sunak now is getting a little bit farcical. I keep saying he's absolutely insane with Nadim Zahawi, and I want to go back to something that people seem to keep forgetting. So what I keep seeing, to catch up for those who may have missed the last day or two of news about Nadim Zahawi. So first of all, Rishi Sunak has said that he wasn't given any advice when a prime minister makes ministerial appointments. They can be given advice by officials. You know, anyone who can possibly become a minister, particularly a senior minister, a secretary of state, say, which Zahawi isn't really a secretary of state, but he is a cabinet minister. Obviously, there's like files on them. There may even be like Secret Service files, but there'll certainly be like a dossier of dodgy things they've got up to in order to try and prevent very unsuitable people taking the reins of office. Or high office. And Rishi Sunak has claimed that no advice was given to him about Nadim Zahawi when he made him, well, he says Tory party chair. It's got nothing to do with Whitehall, what he does with the Tory party, but the fact that he made him a cabinet minister. That is being contradicted now. So there's an article today, this afternoon in The Guardian, saying that he was warned that Zahawi would represent a reputational risk. So that would, if anyone can prove that, if anyone leaks anything which proves that Sunak was told that there were question marks about Zahawi when he appointed him, immediately Rishi Sunak has allowed himself to be put into a position where he has lied in Parliament. He'll be going down exactly the same road as Boris Johnson. Then the other thing, which I mentioned briefly yesterday, so HMRC has admitted that it lied. Before summer last year, or just very early summer anyway, they were asked by Dan Needle, who's a tax lawyer, and the Financial Times, if any ministers, current ministers, were being investigated over their tax affairs. HMRC said no. Well, that was a bit of a lie, because at the time they said no, Nadim Zahawi was under investigation. Then the other suggestion that the Treasury knew that Zahawi was under investigation. Now, it doesn't automatically follow that and this would be at the time when Nadim Zahawi was Education Secretary. So Rishi Sunak was Chancellor still. He was the Chancellor. It doesn't automatically follow that if Treasury officials knew, Sunak would know, but you would think they would have told him. So there's an awful lot of things that Sunak has said now in the House of Commons that seemed unlikely when he said them, but there are things coming out now which suggest he may actually have lied. Missed the last few due to being a judo taxi. I can think of nothing better. I used to love doing judo when I was younger. Big regret of mine giving it up. Although not so much these days. I find other things to amuse myself with. I'll tell you what keeps happening. Every time now I read an article on the latest with and didn't I say this right from the start when Rishi Sunak, and I said as soon as Zahawi's position became untenable, as soon as we knew that he had underpaid this tax, before we even knew he was going to get a fine for it. But certainly at that point, his position was untenable. Sunak should have jettisoned him immediately. Immediately. Because at the point at which it's impossible to keep a minister in position, as soon as you know that, The longer you delay, the worse it is. You have to get rid of them quickly. And I said at the time, and it took no great foresight because it happens every time something like this happens, it won't just be that the pressure will build up. New information will come out on a regular basis. And that is because people who reveal the information initially, or even the journalists, they have more information than is published early on in the stories. They have things kept behind. And what's happening is every day or two we're learning something new. And Sunak has now committed himself to waiting for this ethics advisor's report. So that's going to be another week or so. It might, you know, even if it's done by, let's say, next Friday, that's still every day there's going to be more and more pressure on this. He's insane. But the thing is, people, whenever I see little articles, they keep saying, "Oh, Rishi Sunak, he promised to govern with integrity and accountability," and they say, "Well, this doesn't sound very good." But I would go further than that, and I want to point something out that people seem to be missing. When Rishi Sunak first became Prime Minister, and he made his first speech, and it was a terrible speech, but he made his first speech, and he said he's going to govern with integrity and accountability. Ask yourself why he said that. All prime ministers, of course, want to be able to claim to be governing with integrity and accountability, and a load of other platitudes as well. But why, in his very short speech, and it was a very short speech because it was god awful, why did he say that? The reason he said that is because he knew that's what had turned the public against Boris Johnson. The lack of integrity, the lack of accountability is what had pissed the public off. For all the right-wing media going on about, oh, Boris Johnson, oh, he'd be the man to win the next election. He absolutely wouldn't. The public are royally pissed off with him. That doesn't seem to have cooled down any when you look at polls. Just because Liz Truss was even worse doesn't make people think, oh, Boris Johnson would be better, so we'll have him back. No. So that's why Rishi Sunak said that, because he knew that in order to get the party into a winning position, he had to claim that the lack of integrity and the lack of accountability was entirely down to Boris Johnson, and that under a new, not insane leader, it could come back. So he knew that it's really important to be able to claim that his government has integrity, and yet he has allowed he may not survive this realistically. I don't mean he'll be deposed because of it. What I mean is any chance he may have had of winning the election. I noticed William Hague, and I may talk about this tomorrow. William Hague is talking about, oh, you know, he could still win the election. And it's like things like this could completely ruin any chance at all. Not that I think he has a serious strategy for winning the next election. But anyway, so I'll go through a few comments on this. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is basically the country's head accountant. If they cannot properly deal with their own finances, how can they be trusted with the country? Well, there's two things there. I mean, first of all, thankfully, they're not. They don't actually do any accounting. They've got officials to do that. They set policy. But the idea of being trusted is an interesting one, because if they are not honest or robust with their own finances, yes, we cannot imagine they're going to be the same with their countries. And then saying here, HMRC line is a huge problem. We can't afford any further breakdown of trust in our institutions, and tax could be particularly nasty for Labour if the reputation loss is permanent. Yeah, well, it is a particular problem, of course, and it is why, or one of the reasons why Labour are pushing for such reforms. I mean, do bear in mind, and I do keep having to point this out, you know, Keir Starmer is a bit of a revolutionary. I mean, people think, oh, he's very boring. He just wants to keep things the same, like Tony Blair. Blah, blah, blah. No, he's not at all. The reason he's adopting a similar position is because it's the same position everyone adopts to win an election. And it's why Labour are in such a good position now, because they're not, the strategy, their campaigning isn't mind-blowing, it's not amazing, it's not awesome. You know, it could struggle against a well-led Conservative Party that was trying to capture the centre ground. Where Labour are mostly benefiting is because they are capturing the centre ground, but the Conservatives are not, or they're not even trying to. You know, they're still tilting right because of the forces within the Parliamentary Party and the fear of what Reform UK will do, and the Tory media are keeping them there. But Keir Starmer himself, you know, if you've ever sort of, I mean, I've not followed him through his political life, as in outside of politics, but, you know, he's been very political from a very young man. But when you sort of see what he is, and even very recently, and you think, you know, he put it this way, any little opportunity to bring massive reforms and he will do so. And he has seen a huge opportunity to bring quite a lot of reform to our political system. And again, it's one of the things that makes me really hopeful for proportional representation, which is like, you know, the biggest prize for me. He knows it's broken and he hates the fact that it's broken. But anyway, what do I foresee happening to the Tory party after general election civil war that makes them unelectable for years? So what I see immediately is not them facing facts. I see them blaming various spurious factors. So, and there's lots of them that they can very easily do. So let's look at the situation. It's almost certain that Rishi Sunak will be leading them into that general election, right? Rishi Sunak is not good at politics. He's not a good campaigner. He's not going to be effective in the TV debates. I suspect are going to be god-awful, really terrible. I think, and bear in mind, it's always going to be difficult for the Prime Minister anyway. You imagine the TV debates, not the ones that's just a head-to-head between Starmer and Sunak. I mean, the ones with all the party leaders. Inevitably, the party leaders are all leaders of different parties. They've all got beefs with each other in terms of policy. But all of them will have the big guns out for the Conservatives because the Conservatives are in power. So Labour will be attacking the Conservatives' record. The SNP will be attacking it. The Lib Dems will be attacking it. Plaid will be attacking it. Reform UK, if they invite those back on, will be attacking it. Everyone will be attacking it. So Sunak will already have a difficult job because he's the Prime Minister. Even if he was doing a reasonable job, he would still have a tough time because he would be outnumbered. But he is particularly awful at these things. But did I make a note of your comments? Yes, I did, don't worry. Is there anything to be said for cabinet positions having to be confirmed by the House of Lords, similar to the USA? No, well, I don't think it works very well in the USA, though, does it? Because it can get very partisan. It doesn't stop unsuitable people being made secretaries of state. It can sometimes stop suitable candidates being made secretaries. Like, in theory, if you could have some system that would stop very unsuitable people taking this high office and it was totally objective, you know, like, for example, never having allowed Boris Johnson to be Foreign Secretary and certainly not Prime Minister. If that were possible, sure. But it's not. It will always... Because, like, in America, it's a very different system anyway. Secretaries of State are not themselves elected politicians. Sometimes they can be, but very often they're not. You know, they might be business figures, for example. Whereas in this country, they have to at least be a parliamentarian. You can bring people into the cabinet who are not MPs, but you have to put them in the House of Lords first, if they're not there already, like David Frost, for example. But generally speaking, people want elected MPs in cabinet. And because they're elected MPs, the idea of having unelected people decide whether they're suitable for a ministerial position would be decried as undemocratic, because it would be an unelected person saying that an elected person cannot sit in government. So that means you have to have elected politicians deciding it, and that just gets party political then, and there's no point. It doesn't do any good. Do I think that Starmer will come in and act like Crassus from Spartacus, clear out the stables, try to start something anew? He, like, where he can get away with it, he is a revolutionary. I mean, okay, I don't believe he's not a Trotskyite anymore, but he was when he was young. But even more recently, when you listen to the speeches from before he became Labour leader, he doesn't want to tinker. People will say things, oh, Starmer's just going to tinker. He's absolutely not going to tinker. Obviously, he's not going to then get into power and go, right, I'm changing loads of things. What he does will have to be in line with what he promises, because he needs to win another election. There's nothing he can do in 4 or 5 years that can be set in stone. He needs to win for a longer period of time. So there's no point in getting in and then doing something that'll lose. And also, he wouldn't last anyway. If he did anything that would, cause Labour to plummet in the polls and be certain to lose the next election, he wouldn't be able to stay as leader. He'd be removed. He'd be deposed. So but he will use every opportunity. So we've got reform of the House of Lords. That can easily lead to other reforms as well. We've got, the reform of the NHS, and people are rightly critical of that because the Conservatives keep using the word reform. And I might as well bring this thing back about the old training the doctors then. People are used to hearing the word reform of the NHS in relation to the Conservatives, their reforms have been to remove a load of money, remove a load of staff, break up the NHS trust so they can't coordinate with each other to make the service less efficient. And even under the last Labour government, what did reform mean? It meant, private investment in the NHS. So people are rightly concerned about that because it's like a negative association with the word. Every time socialists have heard the word reform of the NHS, if they're my age or younger, it's not been a good thing. Well, it worked under Labour, but again, it's too short-termism when you actively introduce private investment. It wasn't selling the NHS off. People categorise it as the same as the Tories have done. The Tories have sold bits of the NHS off. What Labour did was add to it, but with private investment. But Starmer again will have, and the thing is, he'll have to do something revolutionary. So I'll come back to this point. So Em made the point that Robespierre reported, and I've seen it as well, that the Conservatives have actively told universities not to train as many doctors. Now, I did mention this one myself in a video a few weeks ago. There's been, for example, an entirely new medical school set up. I can't remember where now. And it's going to have to basically take foreign medical students because the government will not fund British medical students to go there. So we have more capacity to train doctors than we're currently using. Now, someone did say in the comments, quite rightly, an issue is that there aren't quite enough senior doctors to effectively mentor them on placements because there aren't enough doctors. And this is a problem anyway. When you've got massive shortages of workers, you can't just say, let's recruit more workers, because if they need training up, you need a mentor. You imagine in any serious career, even like what would be called an unskilled job, you need someone to show you the ropes. And when it's a highly skilled job, you need someone to formally mentor you. So if we don't have enough of those, that is a limiting factor on how many more people can get in. But Labour are going to have to get more in. They need the NHS to work. It's their thing. So they cannot just say, we'll just have to slowly build the numbers back up. That's no good. So they're going to have to do something, and that is likely to be immigration. It's got to, because where else are you going to get them from? And here's where, and someone's mentioned Hunt, here's where Jeremy Hunt's just said something absolutely balmy. I'll read the comment out because maybe it's related. It may not be. It says, where is Hunt going to get this magical growth from unless the plan is to get GB to sprinkle angel dust on your porridge, in which the unicorns do become real? How is it no one asks from where? Well, not exactly. But I'll tell you what Jeremy Hunt's now saying. Do you know what he's now saying? Because we've got this shortage of workers. It's not just in the NHS, everywhere. Shortage of 1 million workers. Desperately short. The government are planning to try and persuade over 50s to get back in. You know what Jeremy Hunt's now said? He's told the over 50s who are not currently working, get yourselves off the golf course, get yourself a third career. That's what he said. Get yourself off the golf course. Come back and do our grueling labour. If you can manage, if you can, I mean, many people over 50, of course, you know, it may be that they've got health problems that prevent them taking up most jobs. But even though, if let's say it's not the case, you were just able to retire early, you've got enough money to do that. You're not gonna stop your retirement just because the Chancellor says, sorry, we've got into a bit of trouble. But this is what happens when you're, as a government, unable to say, we need some immigration to deal with this. And what is it the Brexiteers kept saying? What did they keep saying? It was like, oh no, we're fine with immigration, we just don't want uncontrolled immigration. Well, it was never uncontrolled. But now we just don't have enough. But the government can't accept that any form of immigration is good. They have to say that immigration can be good under certain circumstances, but they can't say that immigration is the solution to any problem. And yet, where do you get the workers from? You know, the ones who aren't able to do the jobs because they live in a different part of the country, well, they can't do the jobs. The people who can't do the jobs because of health, well, they can't do the jobs. The people who can't do the jobs because they don't have the right skills or qualifications, you could try and train them up, but the government don't want to do that because that costs money. You know, where are you going to get the workers from? If they're not already in this country and willing and able to do those, and in a living where those jobs are, where are you going to get them from? You get them from overseas. All large economies have massive amounts of immigration because massive economies cannot be sustained with a domestic workforce alone. If you want, ultimately, life is a pyramid scheme. Wealthy countries with large economies are basically taking resources off other countries. It's not fair. But it is what it is. If you want to remain a large economy, you know, there's like limited resources in the world. You have to like gather those resources and deprive others of them. And that means we need workers from other countries. But anyway. Say Starmer's not a revolution, but very cautious. For example, he's saying make Brexit work is not supporting PR. Well, I think there is a sense in which he is cautious, but those are not examples of it. That's just strategic. You know, he cannot, if he was planning to introduce PR, I mean, I've already discussed this in video, so I'll not keep going over it. He would be mad to say so now. Absolutely insane to say so. Strategically, it wouldn't even make sense to put it in the manifesto for the next election, but the one after, even though I would like it still to go in for the next one, if it's at all possible. But I would certainly expect it in the one after. Then, in terms of like the make Brexit work, that's again strategic. If he doesn't, if he didn't do that, he will lose the next election. So that's really that simple. You know, Labour don't have the sort of lead that allows them to complete. It's quite mad as well. Like when Starmer first took over, and he first took his Brexit stance, I was actually okay with it because I looked at it as, look, he's not interfering because it's too late to do anything. He's going to let Boris Johnson be completely responsible for the trade agreement we get with the EU. Then the following year he'll be free to attack it. And then that didn't happen. And it's correct the first year. Then the second year it didn't happen. It was this make Brexit work came out, and you thought, what's this about? And you can think about it empirically. You can go, oh, there's loads of people who would vote for Labour if they had a different Brexit policy. And you can think, yeah, but then there's load of people who would not vote for Labour. So which one's right? Well, Labour have now had that position for quite a long time and they're ahead in the polls. You cannot argue with the strategy that has got... And think about where Labour were as well. Not just in the polls, but where they physically were after the 2019 election. They need a large... They need a bigger swing than has ever been achieved in history in this country to win a majority. And yet Labour are currently polling as if they could actually win a comfortable majority. If that happens, it will be something that has never happened ever before. Keir Starmer, cautious, plodding Keir Starmer, will have won a bigger swing than anyone else has ever done. And yes, it's not entirely down to him. Part of it's down to the fact the Conservatives just don't seem to want to win. But nonetheless, if Labour then did an about face on the strategy that got them there, they'd lose it all again. They can easily lose it all again. You know, they have to, like, they've had to be very strategic. I've been impressed that they are very, very strategic. And that's all it is. There's no point in adopting a position just because it's the right position and then not being in a position to enact it. You know, I keep saying, you give me a choice of two leaders of the Labour Party, say, one who has 20 policies in full agreement with my own preferences, my own priorities, and another one who has 10 of them. And if the one with 10 of them is going to win and the one with 20 is not, I'll go with the one for 10. I will absolutely compromise to get something done. Because the problem is, if you back the one who has all the policies the same as you and they lose, you end up with the government that has none of your policies. In fact, the reverse of them. But anyway. I think a lot of the problem getting work after 50 is that employers want to employ younger people as they can pay them less. There is a lot of that, but at the same time, if a business cannot fill a vacancy, then that's not an issue. You know, it only becomes, can this person physically do the job? There are preferences, there is ageism in a lot of, even teaching. I've seen ageism in teaching. And, you know, I had a principal of a college at one time, who gone back a few years now, who was openly ageist. They were quite insane. But it's, although technically I was still hired under them. How old would I have been at the time? I can't remember now. I suppose I would have been youngish. But it's, yeah, if you, so that is a problem if there's like a large field or even a field of candidates for a job, that people can sometimes go for the younger one. They're cheaper. Some people will say, well, they're more enthusiastic, which may or may not be true. You know, there's more hunger, more desire, all the sort of things you do to kid yourself that this cheaper worker will be better. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's fine. And you want a mix anyway. You don't just always want experience, you want some younger ones. But you have, when you cannot fill your position, you don't go, oh, I really want someone younger. It's like, well, you've got me. Do you want me or not? And of course they do, if you can do the job, because you are going to be earning more money for that company than they are paying you in wages and national insurance and pension contributions. What do I think about Keir Starmer's stance on getting closer to the EU industry by industry without rejoining? Seems to be sensible, as I doubt Europe wants us back right now anyway. Yeah, Europe absolutely doesn't want us back anywhere right now. I don't know how quickly that could change, but you have to bear in mind we have shat the bed. Big style. We are not trusted at all. Now, if you look at, say, the USA as a bit of a model, you know, Trump's America was not trusted at all. Biden won back America's reputation reasonably quickly, but I will point out two things. First of all, Biden made a special effort to meet with EU leaders and get close to the EU. He's gone out of his way to emphasize the importance of relationships with the EU, France in particular, I think. And the UK would need to do that. The other advantage Biden, of course, has got is that America is an absolute beast of an economy and not easily ignored. So people are more likely to want to forgive them, so to speak. And of course, America's not asking to join the EU. So for the UK, it's much more difficult and much more protracted. And it's unfortunate. And I know people will think, but if only we could say, You know, if the whole country just went, you know, oh, we regret it, we should change it, and all the politicians did, that somehow we'd be able to join back very quickly. But it would like probably take 10 years, even if that happened, and that hasn't happened. So, but the other thing I will point out as well, and you're talking about what Keir Starmer's been saying, David Lammy gave a speech about Labour's EU policies earlier this week. I don't know whether people saw any of that. And the thing is, I have constantly made the point that Labour's position now, I know they say, oh, you don't need to join the single market, the customs union, and Labour will never join the single union and customs union. You know, they're politicians, they lie. And I kept saying, everything they say, everything they promise is for one parliament. They're not writing the manifesto for 2028 or 2029. They're writing the manifesto for what is probably 2024, although they do have in fact, they've had a work in progress one from last year. They actually did think maybe there'd be a general election last year. As unlikely as it was, they made sure they were ready, because Labour got caught out in 2017. You know, where basically people thought there might be a general election in 2017. Then Theresa May said, no, we're not going to have a general election. And then Labour seemed to go, all right, she said there's not going to be a general election, fair enough. And then there was. It's like, oh, bloody hell, she lied. We weren't ready. So, you know, Labour have not been making that mistake, at least. But the manifesto that they're working on, the policies they're talking about now, are for the next general election, not the one after. Nothing's written for the one after. Nothing at all. And David Lammy made that point. Not as explicitly as I did, but he did make the point that Labour's policies were for the next parliament. You know, he did, if you listen to what David Lammy was saying, he was basically explaining what Labour are going to be doing in the first parliament, and he made it clear this is for the first parliament. And again, it should be obvious as well, because if you look at the Labour leadership, like the most senior members of the shadow cabinet, all of them were very, very strongly against leaving the EU, very clearly. And there was no strategic reason for them to do so within their own party, because they were led by a Eurosceptic leader. It wasn't about personal advancement. They were speaking out against leaving the EU, even though the party's leader was not really wanting them to do so. Anyway, I thought May was trying to pass the Brexit book to Labour by deliberately losing to Corbyn, but the public say, no, you call the referendum, you deal with it. No, she didn't deliberately try to throw the election. I'm quite sure of that. I mean, it's what it looked like. Theresa May had a majority, but it was a small majority. She knew the ERG would not let her go along with any sensible withdrawal agreement. She knew she had to sort of leave, but she also knew that there was no way of getting anything through Parliament, because obviously the opposition would vote against it, and the ERG would also vote against it. So the polls at the time did say that she could increase her majority, so why wouldn't she? And then it just turned out she was crap at campaigning. That she was scared shitless of the public, which no one, even her, I mean, it may have come as a surprise to her that she was very awkward in front of the public. No one could have predicted it, because that's the problem. You know, until you become a political leader, you don't really front a campaign. There's no, unless you've done it in another career or something, you never really know if you're going to be effective. Like, people sort of knew Boris Johnson would be, because he'd fronted these campaigns as candidate for the Mayor of London. So he had led a campaign, a high-profile campaign. So they sort of knew what they were getting with him. That's why he was seen as the best bet to win another election. The EU would like us back in the same way an individual would like to take back a former partner, but on condition they get a job, sort out their drinking, gambling, cannabis smoking. Yes, it is sort of that. I mean, yeah, obviously the EU is wanting to expand its influence, and the UK is a major player economically and, you know, militarily as well. But it's at the moment you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it. It wouldn't, you know. Because the problem is as well, apart from even when the trust is repaired, they still need to know that we're going to be committed members. Because there's no, it's a long, arduous process negotiating. I mean, look at the process for negotiating the withdrawal. We're still doing it. The withdrawal agreement, we started negotiating it in 2017. 2017. It's still going on. It's madness. 6 years later nearly. When was it? About March 2017 that we triggered Article 50. We've been negotiating with the EU over our relationship with them outside of the EU for nearly 6 years. 70 months, basically. It's something else. Did I see the belated apology from Gullis on Twitter? I did, yes. Gone down as bad as you'd expect. All he's like to do is piss off those who share his abhorrent views. Well, this is it, isn't it? This is exactly it. I tell you what I can only assume. I can only assume he got a lot of stick from his constituents, and I mean Tory voting constituents. You know, you've got to bear in mind, Jonathan Gullis still wants to win his seat. He's one of those red wall Tory MPs who wants to win his seat. Is he Stoke? I need to find out. What's his constituency? Stoke-on-Trent North. Right, let's have a look here. I'm just going to have a look how likely it's considered. I mean, that's with current polling, of course. It will be a little bit different. Might be quite interesting. But for those who don't know, Jonathan Gullis shouted a quite crass, even for him, statement in the House of Commons during PMQs, suggesting that all the hundreds of child refugees that has basically been lost by the Home Office, very likely to traffickers, he said it was their own fault for coming here. That's what he said. So he's now had to apologise. Let's have a look here. Right. Do you know, electoral calculus is quite an interesting site. Unfortunately, it's a right pain in the arse because you can look up an individual constituency and it gives you, based on current polling, what the likelihood is of various parties winning it. But the problem is you're not allowed to look up the name of the constituency or the sitting MP. You have to find a postcode from the area. Right. So, according to electoral calculus, they reckon that Labour have a 93% chance of winning it. In other words, Jonathan Gullis is buggered. But he is serious. He does seem to actually want to be trying to fight for his seat. In which case, of course, he can't afford to piss anyone off. Can I post the link? Oh, well, the one I'm looking at the moment, certainly. But yeah, you can... It does... I think it is now updated with the new boundaries as well. May triggered Article 50 due to pressure from the ERG. The EU was happy to delay this. Oh, absolutely. Oh, the EU were happy to delay every move. They have not rushed us on anything. Anything at all. There can be absolutely no complaints. This is what galls me as well, when Brexiteers go, oh, Brexit's gone wrong because of you lot, because of the EU, because of this, that, the other. David Frost even blames the EU for pressuring him. The EU weren't pressuring anyone. Any step of the way. Every time we asked for an extension, we got it. Every single time. The last time we got it, Boris Johnson basically photocopied his arse and sent and faxed it to the EU. They still granted it. You know, that's almost literally what he did as well. Say no way Gullis could go back into teaching. It'd be very unlikely. And I don't just mean because of his views. He'd be very controversial. It would be very difficult anyway for a former MP to go back into teaching, because I would see, I've been on interview panels for teachers, and you would be a bit worried that they might be a bit too, I mean, I've never had a former MP interviewed, but you would think, you think to yourself, they might be a bit up their own arses, because they were an MP. They might be a bit full of themselves. And when it's someone like Jonathan Gullish, you would know they'd be a bit full of themselves. You can do without it. And also there would be concerns as well, because he'd be a very divisive figure. I think even in a very Tory area, which would be his only chance, maybe a private school, maybe, I mean, I don't know if he was a decent teacher or not, or considered a decent teacher. Maybe he was. Maybe he could get a job in a private school. I think he'd struggle in a state school. Given Gullish's previous career before he entered politics, I wonder what kind of teacher he was. And see, I'm not at all sure. You don't always get a lot of information on relatively minor figures. So sometimes you can look up an MP on Wikipedia and it doesn't really have a lot of information on their early career, because unless they're notable enough for someone to go digging, no one who posts on Wikipedia really knows. Think cars will be a relic of the past in about 30 years. We should be investing in putting rail tracks down motorways, making cities non-motorised. Well, I think it'll be the other way around, surely, won't it? With driverless cars, people won't need cars. There'll be, some people will probably have their own, but what's the point? When you need to, what do you need to use your car for? You need to use the car to go to work. You just order one. It's like getting a taxi, only, I mean, that's much more likely. Or you go to the supermarket, just order it. I think that's probably more likely if they're going to be driverless. Because I mean, if I'm honest, if you think about the cost, particularly for people who get new cars, if you think about the cost of a new car, there are lots of people who don't get the value. If they were to have no car, what do you get from the car? You choose the car you want, so the one you're comfortable with, if you've got the money to be able to choose. You have the, it's flexible enough to use it. You can just get in your car and go when you want. But in a lot of situations, they don't necessarily make financial sense for some people. There are plenty of car owners for whom it's not a cost saving over other forms of travel that they could reasonably take, including taxis when necessary. So no, I can see, and also you can get more cars moving around, convoyed, when it's driverless. And when it's working, I don't mean the driverless we have now, which occasionally kills people. I mean, when you've got proper driverless that will be, because they can coordinate amongst each other. Like a driver in a car, you've just got your eyes and they're only in one position at any one time. A car's got sensors all over the place, and there's no reason for them not to really communicate with each other either. So, you could, the driverless cars are so exciting. It will transform things, but I think cars are still going to be very much the way. And yeah, there will be no need to learn to drive. And think about things you can get done on a long journey. You see, because there'll be no need for it's not even like driverless cars from Knight Rider, kit from Knight Rider. There's no need for that. No need for the seats and the steering. You'd have a bed or a comfy sofa or something. Nice comfortable seating area, table to do your work on. That'd be brilliant. How do I know there'd be enough self-driving cars available at peak times? Again, what would peak times be? Again, I think the concept of peak time would go as well, because it's not just in 30 years' time cars that are advancing, working practices. Like we've already seen here, there's lots of people, and the Conservatives want us to be a service-driven economy. And the thing about service jobs is a lot of them are just sat at a desk working on a computer. Like the Tories are fighting against people working from home at the moment, but in the future, is it really going to fly? So peak times may not really be peak times, because if there's an awful lot of people, you know, and the school run, again, driverless car, you're not going to drive your own sprog to there. There'll be the school bus will just go around, get your bus. Oh, there's so many things that can change, so many things. Because everything moves on at the same time. It's not just one thing. Because what you're trying to do is, if you focus on one thing, say improvements in technology for driverless cars, and you imagine that, but in today's world, but it's not, because everything else will change. You know, working practices will change. The technology for working practices will change. What this week? So what was it last week? A surgeon. I can't remember which way round it was, but a surgeon on one side of the Atlantic carried out a remote operation on a banana. They didn't do it on a person, but on a banana at the other side of the Atlantic. I can't remember if it was a surgeon in America doing it in Europe or vice versa. You know, you imagine that. And it worked as well. It didn't, like, you know, mash the banana up. You know, so you just think all of this technology going at the same time, the world will be unrecognisable. You think back 30 years as well, unrecognisable. You know, imagine smartphones 30 years ago. What was happening 30 years ago? We still had fax machines. Actually, Putin's still got a fax machine, hasn't he? But we people used fax machines. We had dial-up internet. Do you remember Net Vampire? The only way of bloody downloading anything. Because otherwise some arsehole would use the phone and cut your connection. Oh, that's the download gone then. Anyway, right, I'm probably going off the point here. This seems less political now and more futurology. But we will see. We will see what happens. The problem with rail track is you can't have a railway just pop to your house to take you to the shops. That's the problem there. There is an argument for much better mass transit, certainly than in this country, because it's rubbish. But no, cars are still going to be the way. Just not owned cars, which will clear up the bloody streets, because most houses weren't designed for even one car ownership, let alone multiple car ownership, so they just clog the roads up. And that'll go away. Imagine that. That'll go away. Roads are clear again. People can cycle safely. Why don't we consider a written constitution? Okay, so someone did ask earlier on about that as well. First of all, I codified constitution, I must insist. We have a written constitution, it's just not codified. I am opposed to a codified constitution, I have to say. But for those who are more in favour, what I will point out is Gordon Brown published a document a little while ago, and obviously people would have read some of the marquee proposals in it, including replacing the unelected House of Lords with an elected body. But if you read the whole document that Gordon Brown produced, and if you look at it, it doesn't explicitly say a codified constitution. But if it were to be implemented in full, and that's a big if, because there's no suggestion that Keir Starmer is getting behind having it in full, and certainly not in the first Parliament, but he is getting behind many of the things in it. But if it were to be implemented in full, it would actually involve a codified constitution. Because sprinkled throughout the document are constitutional rights to various things, which could only be put in place with a codified constitution. So Gordon Brown's basically arguing for one without explicitly saying so. If Labour get behind it, we may end up with one. As I say, I am not in favour. The problem with a codified constitution is that the whole point of it is to prevent changes in the future, or to make them much more difficult to put in place. And there's two problems with that. First of all, you can then end up with very archaic things in place just because some traditionalists don't want to get rid of them. And the second problem is any codified constitution is whatever the people who wrote it thought was a good idea. Like people, for example, arguing for a codified constitution now. It's time we had one. I would go, is it? Do you want Dominic Raab writing it? Because that's who would write it. I don't want him writing it. So you have to think to yourself, who do you want to write it? Because there's nothing in our constitution, because we do have a constitution, there's nothing in our constitution says that in order to enact a codified constitution, in other words, to add a more robust constitution, a less flexible one, there's no requirement for it to have a supermajority. There's no requirement for it to have cross-party support. The Conservatives could right now, if they wanted to, introduce a codified, well, they probably haven't got time now. They probably should have started it in 2020 or 2021. But in theory, they could introduce a codified constitution and it would be in place. And then that would be that. And then part of it could be that in order to make changes, you need a supermajority. So what could happen is 50.5% of MPs could introduce a codified constitution and in it say that you can't change any of this unless you've got 75% of MPs saying so. You could do that and that would all go through. Nothing to stop it. The House of Lords couldn't stop it because if they tried, the House of Commons will just force it through the next year or the next session of Parliament. I just think you have to be very, very careful what you want for, like, because the problem is when people say, oh, we should have this or we should have that, and you think about the benefits it brings, but you must think about the downsides. You must think about the ways it can be corrupted. I prefer a more flexible constitution, and I would actually say that our constitution has actually protected us from the worst excesses of the Conservatives. They have not been able to use the constitution to their benefit. The problem with the codified constitution would be political consent from the SNP, Plaid, Sinn Féin. They wouldn't need it. And that's another problem. They wouldn't need it. So it would be another thing rammed through, imposed on other governments, effectively. After all the recent disclosures, whose job is less safe, Raab or Sunak? Oh, Raab's going. He's going. Sunak will outlast Raab easily. Raab's going. He's just going to take a little longer than Zahawi, that's all. Bear in mind, there's a top lawyer, independent lawyer, investigating Raab's bullying. Yes, Sunak in theory could change the report just like Boris Johnson did, but it's quite a robust process. Raab is not getting away with this. It's taken a very long time because there are a huge number of complaints. Massive number of complaints. A constitution would have stopped Brexit, would it? Why would it? A particular type of codified constitution could have stopped Brexit if that codified constitution said to make any major constitutional change requires a majority of 75% of MPs, or requires at least 3 legislatures. Like, you know, if you say you've got Westminster, the Senate, Holyrood, Stormont, you know, if at least 3 of them, or if Westminster plus 2 of the others, if you say, have to approve of it to go through, yeah, you can say that could have stopped Brexit. But what if that wasn't it? There's nothing that says that has to be in a codified. Codified constitution isn't a set thing. It's whoever writes it at the time. You know, just because you could in theory use something like that to have stopped Brexit doesn't mean to say if we had one it would have done. And as I say, you can have things in there that become problematic. Because then people go, oh, no, it's in the Constitution, we can't. You know, like in America with gun laws, even though it's not in the Constitution, it's a load of bollocks. But they'll still say it. It's like, oh, the Constitution, oh yeah, you can't touch the Constitution. Even though there's like loads of amendments. Do people know what an amendment is? Oh yeah, you can't touch the Constitution, it's sacrosanct. You know, because people who lived 250 years ago knew exactly what was needed right now. Strange how easy it is to cause an alternate discourse on chocolate biscuits, Twix or Jive. I don't know what Jive is. Well, I do, but not in a biscuit context. I haven't had a Twix for years, you know. I haven't actually had a Twix for years. I don't know why that is. I don't dislike them. Anyway, all right. I've just been waffling on again, and apparently there's conversations going about other things. All right. Parcel Rogue saying here, Raab has 24 to 30 civil servants with official complaints of bullying by Raab. Some brutal stories will come out his career and seat. His career is, and his seat is looking very, very dodgy. Yes, he does not look like he'll be winning his seat at the next election either. And you would think, see, even if a lot of stuff doesn't come out, and bear in mind, I can see Sunak trying to he won't want all the gory details coming out because it will reflect very badly on him, because Rishi Sunak appointed him, even though, because again, all of these things come back to Sunak. Sunak appointed him. Sunak can't, well, he can try and say, well, I didn't know about these things. Nobody's going to believe it because this bullying goes back years. He was a cabinet colleague of his for years while the bullying was going on. How can he not have known? How can he not have been told? In fact, we knew quite early on that, you know, when Dominic Raab was made Justice Secretary again, senior officials there had told other staff in the department, you don't have to work here if you don't want. We can move you somewhere else. But also, if you do decide to stay, you will never ever be allowed in the same room as him without a senior official present to basically chaperone. So I knew that ages ago. How on earth does Sunak allow that person to remain in post? I'm saying there, going back to Brexit, I reckon all the extensions we had before actually leaving the EU, with the EU's way of saying, look, we're offering you chances to stay here. Hindsight's great, though, isn't it? The EU didn't want us to leave at all. Now that we have, and the way we've behaved, obviously they don't want us back. But the reason for that is not being fickle. It is just practical. It's immensely disruptive having a new member join. It takes a very long time. And the problem is there's a lot of people in this country don't appreciate that. They think just because we left that we can go back quickly. Well, we used to be members. We've diverged so much and there's so much to do. But I will say this in terms of what is a very clear intention from the EU. The trade and cooperation agreement that Boris Johnson concluded at the end of 2020 is up for renegotiation in 2025. Come what may. You know, when Labour say renegotiate it, they don't mean go to the EU and ask to renegotiate it. It's being renegotiated. Whoever is in government in 2025 is renegotiating that deal. It was a short-term deal. Now, when you consider that that agreement was basically everything the EU asked for, because Boris Johnson, in order to get his agreement, because they weren't in a hurry, that's what I mean. At no stage in the process were the EU in a hurry. They were just sat there with the feet up going, look, when you're ready, let us know. You know, so basically in a negotiation, any negotiation, what each side has their thing. This is what we want, the other side, no, this is what we want. And you slowly move towards somewhere in the middle. Boris Johnson was in too much haste. The EU knew that. He said, we want this, this, this and this. And the EU went, no. And he went, I want this. Okay, well, this may take a while. Give it, we'll see where we are in a few years. And Boris Johnson went, no, I need a deal by the end of this year. I promised my voters. And the EU basically said, oh dear. Then the onus seems to be on you to agree to our agreement. So basically, the trading cooperation is basically what the EU wanted. And the fact that there's a clause in there that says the whole thing has to be done again. If you were thinking to yourself, the EU cannot be asked with all these negotiations dragging on and on and on, why did they make sure there was a clause in there that meant the whole thing had to be redone? Because they hoped that, not necessarily that Labour would be in government then, but they hoped that when the reality of Brexit had hit, whoever was in government then, they did know it would be after the election. They knew there'd be an election, so there was a chance of a completely different government. But they expected that whoever was in government at the time would need to take a more pragmatic look at things. That is what they expected. If you don't mind me asking, am I NT or ND? Just that I'm ND. I'm talking about sort of I have to go on tangents and end up waffling. I don't know what that means. I don't know what NT or ND are. I might do when you say what they are, but they're not ringing a bell. A bit of a tangent. Is it worth having reserved matters that devolved powers can legislate on that Westminster can't make laws on without consultation from all devolved powers? Yes, I think so. I don't see any reason where in a devolved nation for Westminster to have quite so much power as it does. You know, I would, in an ideal world, I don't think we'll ever get to this because it involves politicians giving up their own power. Neurotypical, neurodiverse. I don't really know. I'm not really going to be a good judge of that. I am often, my partner often says that I'm not at all normal though. In terms of my reactions to all sorts of things. But yeah, I don't really see that Westminster should. There are things that bind a nation together. Obviously, Westminster needs to look after national institutions like the armed forces. We don't want separate armed forces in the country. That's not great. You know, there's general tax regimes, again, is fine. You don't want to have different tax rates because then the individual nations will all compete against each other. And it's not that a union can't survive that because the EU have that sort of arrangement, but you know, it's largely better not. But there are plenty of things that, like for example, Westminster shouldn't decide anything on education because what does it decide and matters anyway? England and Wales. Welsh Parliament can do the Welsh system. Northern Ireland and Scotland have their own system anyway. And so why don't we have a separate body, separate to Westminster, to decide matters for England? I would say in English Parliament, you could argue there needs to be several English Parliaments, but you know, it's an absolute nonsense really. And I know why it occurred, but it is a nonsense. If you were building the country from scratch as it is, you wouldn't have Westminster as it is now. You would have Westminster be the Parliament that decides on a relatively small number of issues that are, you know, almost like a federal system is what you want. You want state and federal legislatures and for them not to too directly interfere with each other. Anyway, sort of run out of time, so let's go through the last few. What do I think about the recent comments of Rod Stewart about the NHS? Is this a fillip for Labour? I don't know. At the end of the day, obviously, it's always good news for any opposition party when a long-term voter for the government says, do you know what, they've had the time, this is crap. Because, you know, when someone influential, I don't know how influential he is actually, but he's certainly famous. When someone famous says, look, I've always supported this party, but they've gone a bit loopy, they've run out of ideas, they've run out of steam, we need to give the other lot a chance. That's always a boost for the other lot. I don't know that it's suddenly going to convert 1 million people to them, but you know. During Jeremy Hunt's Bloomberg speech on Friday, he said he hopes for an enterprise and digital economy. How's that possible when businesses are buggered by slow broadband speeds? Well, quite. It's just words. All of it's just aims. We want this, as if that means it's suddenly going to happen. Oh, the government said they would like this. Oh, that's good. They're going to do this. No, they're not going to do it. They're not going to do anything. They just say they want it. They just want it to materialise. And the Conservatives have this faint notion that it'll just pop up. If there's a need for something, it'll just spring up out of the ground. The private sector will provide it. No, they won't provide it unless there's a profit in it for them. Boris Johnson used to whine like buggery. You know, when it became very apparent that our road services were really poor. You know, France have been investing, you know, the French government have been aggressively investing, if that's the right word, in suitable services on the roads for truckers. We don't. Boris Johnson thought, well, the private sector, if there's a need for it, the private sector will provide it. And the private sector was saying, well, no, there's no money in it. We're not going to provide it. It's the same as his thing about saying that, oh, there's not enough lorry drivers, lorry companies should train them. Well, they do train some, but it's not up to them. If there's a need for something, That's what the government's supposed to do. If there's a national need for something, that's for the government to deal with. Because if there's a national need for something, by definition, the private sector hasn't provided it. That's why there's a need. But anyway. England, with the bigger population, took the power away from Scotland in the equal union. So I don't know where this equal union thing came from, really. But yeah, you were quite right. It can't be in that sense, because obviously you can't give equal seats to each of the 4 nations of the UK in Westminster, because it's already the case that a Scottish voter has more power in Westminster than an English voter, because you have fewer Scottish voters for the number of seats, if you see what I mean. But obviously there's many more English people, so they end up with way more MPs. And it's like, you have to have, an MP has to be elected by roughly comparable number of electors, ideally. So yeah, inevitably it works that way. But then people will sort of say that England itself is not homogenous, hugely different, you know. But people see it in terms of those national boundaries. But anyway, saying the private sector do out for the public is nuts. Well, yeah, their top priority is profit. In fact, it's their only priority. Their only priority is profit. You know, I would prefer an economy where the government insisted that all businesses have to justify their existence to the benefit to society. You know, businesses need to be judged on their benefit to society. But we'll never go that far, will we? We're better for the UK if Labour works on the UK before looking at the EU, so they can have things in place like nationalisation of services before joining. The joining is now clear. It's going to be a very long time away. I think we could have had more rapid progress were it not for smoke screens. At the end of the day, Brexit is hidden behind COVID. Brexit is hidden behind the war in Ukraine. You know, and if you sort of imagine what would have happened if COVID hadn't have existed, if there'd been no pandemic, if there'd been no, war in Ukraine, if none of this had happened, if we'd have just had a normal few years, the public view of Brexit would be very, very different right now. Very different. And it's not that Brexit would be worse. Actually, Brexit is worse because of those things. It was made worse because of those things. It's just that it can't hide behind them. Or it wouldn't have been able to hide behind them. So there'd be no blaming it on this, that or the other. It would all be laid bare. But it hasn't happened. So that, there's no getting away from it. That massively extends the amount of time it's going to take for the public to realise. But anyway, we'll have to call it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. We'll be back on again, of course, next week. Well, it'll be a different month. It'll be in a new month. We may be close to knowing when Boris Johnson's going to be giving his evidence. But thanks for coming on. Until next time, I'll see you later.